Don Juan was talking to me. I couldn't understand him. I concentrated my attention on his lips. The sensation I had was dreamlike. I was trying to rip from the inside an enveloping film-like sheet that encased me, while Don Juan tried to rip it from the outside. Finally, it actually popped, and Don Juan's words became audible and their meaning crystal clear. He was commanding me to surface by myself. I struggled desperately to gain my sobriety. I had no success. I quite consciously wondered why I was having so much trouble. I fought to talk to myself. Don Juan seemed to be aware of my difficulty. He urged me to try harder. Something out there was preventing me from engaging myself in my familiar internal dialogue. It was as if a strange force were making me drowsy and indifferent. I fought against it until I began to lose my breath. I heard Don Juan talking to me. My body contorted involuntarily with attention. I felt as if I were embraced and locked in mortal combat with something that was keeping me from breathing. I didn't have fear, but rather some uncontrollable fury possessed me. My wrath mounted to such heights that I growled and screamed like an animal. Then, my body was taken by a seizure. I had a jolt that stopped me instantly. I could again breathe normally, and then I realized that Don Juan had poured his gourd of water over my stomach and neck, soaking me. He helped me sit up. Don Genaro was standing on the ledge. He called my name and then jumped to the ground. I saw him plummeting down from a height of 50 feet or so, and I experienced an unbearable sensation around my umbilical region. I had had the same sensation in dreams of falling. Don Genaro came to me and asked me, smiling, if I had liked his lead. I tried unsuccessfully to say something. Don Genaro called my name again. "Carlitos, watch me," he said. He swung his arms at his sides 4 or 5 times as if to get momentum, and then jumped out of sight, or I thought he did, or perhaps he did something else for which I had no description. He was 5 or 6 feet away from me, and then he vanished, as if he had been sucked away by an uncontrollable force. I felt aloof and tired. I had a sense of indifference and didn't want to think or talk to myself. I wasn't afraid, but inexplicably sad. I wanted to weep. Don Juan hit me repeatedly with his knuckles on the top of my head and laughed as if everything that had happened were a joke. He then demanded that I talk to myself because that was the time when the internal dialogue was desperately needed. I heard him ordering me, "Talk, talk." I had an involuntary spasm in the muscles of my lips. My mouth moved without sound. I remember Don Genaro moving his mouth in a similar way when he was clowning, and I wished I could have said, as he had, "My mouth doesn't want to talk." I tried to voice the words, and my lips contorted in a painful way. Don Juan seemed to be on the verge of collapsing with laughter. His enjoyment was contagious, and I also laughed. Finally, he helped me to stand up. I asked him if Don Genaro was coming back. He said that Don Genaro had had enough of me for the day. "You almost made it," Don Juan said. We'd been sitting near the fire on the earth stove. He had insisted that I eat. I wasn't hungry or tired. An unusual melancholy had overtaken me. I felt removed from all the events of the day. Don Juan handed me my writing pad. I made a supreme effort to recapture my usual state. I jotted down some comments. Little by little, I brought myself back into my old pattern. It was as if a veil were being lifted. Suddenly, I was again involved in my familiar attitude of interest and bewilderment. "Good, good," Don Juan said, patting my head. I've told you that the true art of a warrior is to balance terror and wonder. Don Juan's mood was unusual. He seemed almost nervous, anxious. He appeared to be willing to speak on his own accord. I believed that he was preparing me for the sorcerer's explanation, and I became quite anxious myself. His eyes had a strange glimmer that I had seen only a few times before. After I told him what I thought of his unusual attitude, he said that he was happy for me, that as a warrior he could rejoice in the triumphs of his fellow men, if they were triumphs of the spirit. He added that, unfortunately, I was not yet ready for the sorcerer's explanation, in spite of the fact that I had successfully solved Don Genaro's riddle. His contention was that when he had poured water over my body, I had actually been dying, and my whole achievement had been cancelled out by my incapacity to fend off the last of Don Genaro's onslaughts. Genaro's power was like a tide that engulfed you, he said. Did Don Genaro want to hurt me? I asked. No, he said. Genaro wants to help you. But power can be met only with power. He was testing you, and you failed. But I solved his riddle, didn't I? You did fine, he said. So fine that Genaro had to believe that you were capable of a complete warrior's feat. You almost made it. What floored you this time was not indulging, though. What was it then? You're too impatient and violent. Instead of relaxing and going with Genaro, you began to fight him. You can't win against him. He's stronger than you. Don Juan then volunteered some advice and suggestions about my personal relations with people. His remarks were a serious sequel to what Don Genaro had jokingly said to me earlier. He was in a talkative mood, and without any coaxing on my part, he began to explain what had taken place during the last 2 times I had been there. As you know, he said, the crux of sorcery is the internal dialogue. That is the key to everything. When a warrior learns to stop it, everything becomes possible. The most far-fetched schemes become attainable. The passageway to all the weird and eerie experiences that you have had recently was the fact that you could stop talking to yourself. You have, in complete sobriety, witnessed the ally, Genaro's double, the dreamer and the dreamed, and today you almost learned about the totality of yourself. That was the warrior's feat that Genaro expected you to perform. All this has been possible because of the amount of personal power that you have restored. It started the last time you were here, when I caught sight of a very auspicious omen. As you arrived, I heard the ally prowling around. First, I heard its soft steps, and then I saw the moth looking at you as you got out of your car. The ally was motionless, watching you. That, to me, was the best omen. Had the ally been agitated, moving around as if it was displeased with your presence, the way it always has been, the course of the events would have been different. Many times, I have caught sight of the ally in an unfriendly state towards you. This time the omen was right, and I knew the ally had a piece of knowledge for you. That was the reason why I said that you had an appointment with knowledge, an appointment with a moth that had been pending for a long time. For reasons inconceivable to us, the ally selected the form of a moth to manifest itself to you. But you said that the ally was formless and that one could only judge its effects, I said. That is right, he said. But the ally is a moth for the onlookers who are associated with you, Genaro and myself. For you, the ally is only an effect, a sensation in your body, or a sound, or the golden specks of knowledge. It remains as a fact, nonetheless, that by choosing the form of a moth, the ally is telling Genaro and me something of great importance. Moths are the givers of knowledge and the friends and helpers of sorcerers. It is because the ally chose to be a moth around you that Genaro places such a great emphasis on you. That night that you met the moth, as I had anticipated, was a true appointment with knowledge for you. You learned the moth's call, felt the gold dust of its wings. But above all, that night for the first time, you were aware that you saw, and your body learned that we are luminous beings. You have not yet assessed correctly that monumental event in your life. Genaro demonstrated for you with tremendous force and clarity that we are a feeling, and that what we call our body is a cluster of luminous fibers that have awareness. Last night, you were back again under the good auspices of the ally. I came to look at you as you arrived, and I knew that I had to call Genaro so he could explain to you the mystery of the dreamer and the dream. You believed then, just as you always have, that I was tricking you. But Genaro was not hiding in the bushes as you thought. He came over for you, even if your reason refuses to believe it. That part of Don Juan's elucidation was indeed the hardest to take at its face value. I couldn't admit it. I said that Don Genaro had been real and of this world. Everything that you've witnessed so far has been real and of this world, he said. There is no other world. Your stumbling block is a peculiar insistence on your part, and that peculiarity of yours is not going to be cured by explanations. So today, Genaro addressed himself directly to your body. A careful examination of what you did today will reveal to you that your body put things together in a most praiseworthy manner. Somehow, you refrained from indulging in your visions at the irrigation ditch. You kept a rare control and aloofness, as warriors should. You didn't believe anything, but you still acted efficiently, and thus you were capable of following Genaro's call. You actually found him without any aid from me. When we arrived at the rock ledge, you were imbued with power, and you saw Genaro standing where other sorcerers have stood for similar reasons. He walked over to you after jumping from the ledge. He himself was all power. Had you proceeded as you did earlier by the irrigation ditch, you would have seen him as he really is, a luminous being. Instead, you got frightened, especially when Genaro made you leap. That leap in itself should have been sufficient to transport you beyond your boundaries, but you didn't have the strength. Fell back into the world of your reason. Then, of course, you entered into mortal combat with yourself. Something in you, your will, wanted to go with Genaro while your reason opposed him. Had I not helped you, you now would be lying dead, buried in that power. But even with my help, the outcome was dubious, wasn't it? We were silent for a few minutes. I waited for him to speak. Finally, I asked, did Don Genaro make me leap up to the rock ledge? Don't take that leap in the sense that you understand, he said. Once again, this is only a way of speaking. As long as you think that you are a solid body, you cannot conceive what I am talking about. He then spilled some ashes on the ground by the lantern, covering an area about 2 feet square, and drew a diagram with his fingers. A diagram that had 8 points interconnected with lines. It was a geometrical figure. He had drawn a similar one years before when he tried to explain to me that it was not an illusion that I had observed the same leaf falling 4 times from the same tree. The diagram in the ashes had 2 epicenters. One he called reason, the other will. Reason was interconnected directly with a point he called talking. Through talking, reason was indirectly connected to 3 other points: feeling, dreaming, and seeing. The other epicenter, will, was directly connected to feeling, dreaming, and seeing, but only indirectly to reason and talking. I remarked that the diagram was different from the one I had recorded years before. The outer form is of no importance, he said. These points represent a human being and can be drawn in any way you want. Do they represent the body of a human being? I asked. Don't call it the body, he said. These are 8 points on the fibers of a luminous being. A sorcerer says, as you can see in the diagram, that a human being is first of all will, because will is directly connected to 3 points: feeling, dreaming, and seeing. Then next, a human being is reason. This is properly a center and smaller than will. It is connected only with talking. What are the other 2 points, Don Juan? He looked at me and smiled. You're a lot stronger now than you were the first time we talked about this diagram, he said. But you're not yet strong enough to know all the 8 points. Genaro will someday show you the other 2. Does everybody have those 8 points, or only sorcerers? We may say every one of us brings to the world 8 points. 2 of them, reason and talking, are known by everyone. Feeling is always vague but somehow familiar, but only in the world of sorcerers does one get fully acquainted with dreaming, seeing, and will. And finally, at the outer edge of the world, one encounters the other 2. The 8 points make the totality of oneself. He showed me in the diagram that, in essence, all the points could be made to connect with one another indirectly. I asked him again about the 2 mysterious remaining points. He showed me that they were connected only to will, and that they were removed from feeling, dreaming, and seeing, and much more distant from talking and reasoning. He pointed with his finger to show that they were isolated from the rest and from each other. Those 2 points will never yield to talking or to reason, he said. Only will can handle them. Reason is so removed from them that it is utterly useless to try figuring them out. This is one of the hardest things to realize. After all, the force of reason is to reason out everything. I asked him if the 8 points corresponded to areas or to certain organs in a human being. They do, he replied dryly, and erased the diagram. He touched my head and said that was the center of reason and talking. The tip of my sternum was the center of feeling. The area below the navel was will. Dreaming was on the right side against the ribs. Seeing was on the left. He said that sometimes in some warriors, seeing and dreaming were on the right side. Where are the other 2 points? I asked. He gave me a most obscene answer and broke into a belly laugh. You're so sneaky, he said. You think I'm a sleepy old goat, don't you? I explained to him that my questions created their own momentum. Don't try to hurry, he said. You'll know in due time, and then you will be on your own, by yourself. Do you mean that I won't see you anymore, Don Juan? Not ever again, he said. Genaro and I will be then what we always have been, dust on the road. I had a jolt in the pit of my stomach. What are you saying, Don Juan? I'm saying that we are all unfathomable beings, luminous and boundless. You, Genaro, and I are stuck together by a purpose that is not our decision. What purpose are you talking about? Learning the warrior's way. You can't get out of it, neither can we. As long as our achievement is pending, you will find me or Genaro, but once it is accomplished, you will fly freely, and no one knows where the force of your life will take you. What is Don Genaro doing in this? That subject is not in your realm yet, he said. Today, I have to pound the nail that Genaro put in, the fact that we are luminous beings. We are perceivers. We are an awareness. We are not objects. We have no solidity. We are boundless. The world of objects and solidity is a way of making our passage on earth convenient. It is only a description that was created to help us. We, or rather our reason, forget that the description is only a description, and thus we entrap the totality of ourselves in a vicious circle from which we rarely emerge in our lifetime. At this moment, for instance, you are involved in extricating yourself from the snarls of reason. It is preposterous and unthinkable for you that Genaro just appeared at the edge of the chaparral, and yet you cannot deny that you witnessed it. You perceived it as such. Don Juan chuckled. He carefully drew another diagram in the ashes and covered it with his hat before I could copy it. We are perceivers, he proceeded. The world that we perceive, though, is an illusion. It was created by a description that was told to us since the moment we were born. We, the luminous beings, are born with 2 rings of power, but we use only one to create the world. That ring, which is hooked very soon after we are born, is reason, and its companion is talking. Between the two, they concoct and maintain the world. So in essence, the world that your reason wants to sustain is the world created by a description and its dogmatic and inviolable rules, which the reason learns to accept and defend. The secret of the luminous beings is that they have another ring of power which is never used, the will. The trick of the sorcerer is the same trick of the average man. Both have a description. One, the average man, upholds it with his reason. The other, the sorcerer, upholds it with his will. Both descriptions have their rules, and the rules are perceivable, but the advantage of the sorcerer is that will is more engulfing than reason. The suggestion that I want to make at this point is that from now on, you should let yourself perceive whether the description is upheld by your reason or by your will. I feel that is the only way for you to use your daily world as a challenge and a vehicle to accumulate enough personal power in order to get to the totality of yourself. Perhaps the next time that you come, you'll have enough of it. At any rate, wait until you feel like you felt today at the irrigation ditch, that an inner voice is telling you to do so. If you come in any other spirit, it'll be a waste of time and a danger to you. I remarked that if I had to wait for that inner voice, I would never see them again. You'd be surprised how well one can perform if one is against the wall, he said. He stood up and picked up a bundle of firewood. He placed some dry sticks on the earth stove. The flames cast a yellowish glow on the ground. He then turned off the lantern and squatted in front of his hat, which was covering the drawing he had made in the ashes. He commanded me to sit calmly, shut off my internal dialogue, and keep my eyes on his hat. And I struggled for a few moments, and then I felt a sensation of floating, of falling off a cliff. It was as if nothing were supporting me, as if I were not sitting or did not have a body. Don Juan lifted his hat. Underneath, there were spirals of ashes. I watched them without thinking. I felt the spirals moving. I felt them in my stomach. The ashes seemed to pile up. Then they were stirred and fluffed, and suddenly, Don Genaro was sitting in front of me. The sight forced me instantly into my internal dialogue. I thought that I must have fallen asleep. I began to breathe in short gasps and tried to open my eyes, but my eyes were open. I heard Don Juan telling me to get up and move around. I jumped up and ran to the ramada. Don Juan and Don Genaro ran after me. Don Juan brought his lantern. I couldn't catch my breath. I tried to calm myself as I'd done before by jogging in place while I faced the west. I lifted my arms and began breathing. Don Juan came to my side and said that those movements were done only in the twilight. Don Genaro yelled that it was twilight for me, and both of them began to laugh. Don Genaro ran to the edge of the bushes and then bounced back to the ramada as if he had been attached to a giant rubber band that made him snap back. He repeated the same movement 3 or 4 times and then came to my side. Don Juan had been looking at me fixedly, giggling like a child. They exchanged a furtive glance. Don Juan said to Don Genaro in a loud voice that my reason was dangerous and that it could kill me if it was not placated. "For heaven's sake!" Don Genaro exclaimed in a roaring voice. "Placate his reason!" They jumped up and down and laughed like 2 children. Don Juan made me sit down underneath the lantern and handed me my notebook. "Tonight, we're really pulling your leg," he said in a conciliatory tone. "Don't be afraid. Genaro is hiding under my hat." Part 2. The Tonal and the Nagual. Having to believe. I walked towards downtown on the Paseo de la Reforma. I was tired. The altitude of Mexico City no doubt had something to do with it. I could have taken a bus or a taxi, but somehow, in spite of my fatigue, I wanted to walk. It was Sunday afternoon. The traffic was minimal, and yet the exhaust fumes of the buses and trucks with diesel engines made the narrow streets of downtown seem like canyons of smog. I arrived at the Zócalo and noticed that the Cathedral of Mexico City seemed to be more slanted than the last time I had seen it. I stepped a few feet inside the enormous halls. A cynical thought crossed my mind. From there, I headed for the Lagunilla market. I had no definite purpose in mind. I walked aimlessly, but at a good pace, without looking at anything in particular. I ended up at the stands of old coins and second-hand books. "Hello, hello, look who's here," someone said, tapping me lightly on the shoulder. The voice and the touch made me jump. I quickly turned to my right. My mouth opened in surprise. The person who had spoken to me was Don Juan. "My God, Don Juan!" I exclaimed, and a shiver took my body from head to toe. "What are you doing here?" "What are you doing here?" he retorted as an echo. I told him that I had stopped in the city for a couple of days before venturing into the mountains of central Mexico to search for him. "Well, let's say then that I came down from the mountains to find you," he said, smiling. He patted me on the shoulder several times. He seemed to be glad to see me. He put his hands on his hips and swelled his chest and asked me whether or not I liked his appearance. It was only then that I noticed he was wearing a suit. The full impact of such an incongruity hit me. I was dumbfounded. "How do you like my tacuche?" he asked, beaming. He used the slang word tacuche instead of the standard Spanish word traje for suit. "Today I'm in a suit," he said, as if he had to explain. And then, pointing to my open mouth, he added, "Close it, close it." I laughed absent-mindedly. He noticed my confusion. His body shook with laughter as he turned around so I could see him from every angle. His attire was incredible. He was wearing a light brown suit with pinstripes, brown shoes, a white shirt, and a necktie. And that made me wonder if he had any socks on, or was he wearing his shoes without them? What added to my bewilderment was the maddening sensation I had had that when Don Juan tapped me on the shoulder and I turned around, I thought I had seen him in his khaki pants and shirt, his sandals and his straw hat. And then as he made me aware of his attire and as I focused my attention on every detail of it, the complete unit of his dress became fixed. as if I had created it with my thoughts. My mouth seemed to be the area of my body which was most taxed by the surprise. It opened involuntarily. Don Juan touched me gently on my chin as if he were helping me to close it. "You certainly are developing a double chin," he said, and laughed in short spurts. I became aware then that he didn't have a hat on, and that his short white hair was parted on the right side. He looked like an old Mexican gentleman, an impeccably tailored urban dweller. I told him that to have found him there was so unnerving to me that I had to sit down. He was very understanding and suggested that we go to a nearby park. We walked a few blocks in complete silence, and then we arrived at the Plaza Garibaldi, a place where musicians offered their services, a sort of musicians' employment center. Don Juan and I merged with scores of spectators and tourists and walked around the park. After a while, he stopped, leaned against a wall, and pulled his pants up slightly at the knees. He was wearing light brown socks. I asked him to tell me the meaning of his mysterious apparel. His vague reply was that he simply had to be in a suit that day, for reasons that would be clear to me later. Finding Don Juan in a suit had been so unearthly that my agitation was almost uncontrollable. I hadn't seen him for several months, and I wanted more than anything else in the world to talk with him, but somehow the setting was wrong, and my attention meandered around. Don Juan must have noticed my anxiety and suggested that we walk to La Alameda, a more quiet park a few blocks away. There weren't too many people in the park, and we had no trouble finding an empty bench. We sat down. My nervousness had given way to a feeling of uneasiness. I did not dare to look at Don Juan. There was a long, unnerving pause. Still, without looking at him, I said that the inner voice had finally driven me to search for him, that the staggering events I'd witnessed at his house had affected my life very deeply, and that I just had to talk about them. He made a gesture of impatience with his hand and said that his policy was never to dwell on past events. "What's important now is that you've fulfilled my suggestion," he said. "You have taken your daily world as a challenge, and the proof that you have stored sufficient personal power is the indisputable fact that you have found me with no difficulty whatever at the precise spot where you were supposed to." "I doubt very much that I could take credit for that," I said. "I was waiting for you, and then you showed up," he said. "That's all I know. That's all any warrior would care to know." "What's going to happen now that I've found you?" I asked. "For one thing," he said, "we won't discuss the dilemmas of your reason. Those experiences belong to another time, to another mood. They are, properly speaking, only steps of an endless ladder. To emphasize them would mean to take away from the importance of what's taking place now. A warrior cannot possibly afford to do that." I had an almost invincible desire to complain. It wasn't that I resented anything that had happened to me, but I craved solace and sympathy. Don Juan appeared to know my mood and spoke as if I had actually voiced my thoughts. "Only as a warrior can one withstand the path of knowledge," he said. "A warrior cannot complain or regret anything. His life is an endless challenge, and challenges cannot possibly be good or bad. Challenges are simply challenges." His tone was dry and severe, but his smile was warm and disarming. "Now that you are here, what we'll do is wait for an omen," he said. "What kind of an omen?" I asked. "We need to find out whether your power can stand on its own," he said. "The last time it petered out miserably. This time, the circumstances of your personal life appear to have given you, at least on the surface, all the necessaries to deal with the sorcerer's explanation." "Is there a chance that you might tell me about it?" I asked. "It depends on your personal power," he said. As is always the case in the doings and not doings of warriors, personal power is the only thing that matters. So far, I should say, you're doing fine. After a moment's silence, as if wanting to change the subject, he stood up and pointed to his suit. I have put on my suit for you, he said in a mysterious tone. This suit is my challenge. Look how good I look in it. How easy, huh? Nothing to it. Don Juan did look extraordinarily well in a suit. All I could think of as a gauge for comparison was the way my grandfather used to look in his heavy English flannel suit. He always gave me the impression that he felt unnatural, out of place in the suit. Don Juan, on the contrary, was so at ease. Do you think it is easy for me to look natural in a suit? Don Juan asked. I didn't know what to say. I concluded to myself, however, that judging by his appearance and by the way he conducted himself, it was the easiest thing in the world for him. To wear a suit is a challenge for me, he said. A challenge as difficult as wearing sandals and a poncho would be for you. You have never had the necessity to take that as a challenge, though. My case is different. I'm an Indian. We looked at each other. He raised his brows in a silent question, as if asking for my comments. The basic difference between an ordinary man and a warrior is that a warrior takes everything as a challenge, he went on, while an ordinary man takes everything either as a blessing or as a curse. The fact that you are here today indicates that you have tipped the scales in favor of the warrior's way. His stare made me feel nervous. I tried to get up and walk, but he made me sit down. You are going to sit here without fretting until we're through, he said imperatively. We are waiting for an omen. We can't proceed without it, because it isn't enough that you found, as it wasn't enough that you found Genaro that day in the desert. Your power must round itself up and give an indication. I can't figure out what you want, I said. I saw something prowling around this park, he said. Was it the ally? I asked. No, it wasn't. So, we must sit here and find out what kind of omen your power is rounding up. He then asked me to give him a detailed account of how I had carried out the recommendations made by Don Genaro and himself about my daily world and my relations with people. I felt a bit embarrassed. He put me at ease with the argument that my personal affairs were not private because they included a task of sorcery that he and Don Genaro were fostering in me. I jokingly remarked that my life had been ruined because of that task of sorcery, and recounted the difficulties in maintaining my day-to-day world. I talked for a long time. Don Juan laughed at my account until tears were rolling down his cheeks. He slapped his thighs repeatedly. That gesture, which I had seen him do hundreds of times, was definitely out of place when it was done on the pants of a suit. I was filled with apprehension, which I was compelled to voice. Your suit scares me more than anything you've done to me, I said. You'll get used to it, he said. A warrior must be fluid and must shift harmoniously with the world around him, whether it is the world of reason or the world of will. The most dangerous aspect of that shifting comes forth every time the warrior finds that the world is neither one nor the other. I was told that the only way to succeed in that crucial shifting was by proceeding in one's actions as if one believed. In other words, the secret of a warrior is that he believes without believing. But obviously a warrior cannot just say he believes and let it go at that. That would be too easy. To just believe would exonerate him from examining his situation. A warrior, whenever he has to involve himself with believing, does it as a choice, as an expression of his innermost predilection. A warrior doesn't believe. A warrior has to believe. He stared at me for a few seconds as I wrote in my notebook. I remained silent. I couldn't say that I understood the difference, but I didn't want to argue or ask questions. I wanted to think about what he had said, but my mind meandered as I looked around. On the street behind us, there was a long line of automobiles and buses blowing their horns. At the edge of the park, perhaps 20 yards away, directly in line with the bench where we were sitting, a group of about 7 people, including 3 policemen in light gray uniforms, stood over a man lying motionless on the grass. He seemed to be drunk, or perhaps seriously ill. I glanced at Don Juan. He had also been looking at the man. I told him that for some reason, I was incapable of clarifying by myself what he had just said to me. I don't want to ask questions anymore, I said. But if I don't ask you to explain, I don't understand. Not to ask questions is very abnormal for me. Please, be normal, by all means, he said, with feigned seriousness. I said that I didn't understand the difference between believing and having to. To me, both were the same. To conceive that the statements were different was splitting hairs. Remember the story you once told me about your friend and her cats? He asked casually. He looked up at the sky and leaned back against the bench, stretching his legs. He put his hands behind his head and contracted the muscles of his whole body. As it always happens, his bones made a loud cracking sound. He was referring to a story I had once told him about a friend of mine who found 2 kittens almost dead inside a dryer in a laundromat. She revived them and, through excellent nourishment and care, groomed them into 2 gigantic cats, a black one and a reddish one. 2 years later, she sold her house. Since she could not take the cats with her and was unable to find another home for them, all she could do under the circumstances was to take them to an animal hospital and have them put to sleep. I helped her take them. The cats had never been inside a car. She tried to calm them down. They scratched and bit her, especially the reddish cat, the one she called Max. When we finally arrived at the animal hospital, she took the black cat first, holding it in her arms, and without saying a word, she got out of the car. The cat played with her, pawing her gently as she pushed open the glass door to enter the hospital. I glanced at Max. He was sitting in the back. The movement of my head must have scared him, for he dove under the driver's seat. I made the seat slide backwards. I didn't want to reach under it for fear that he would bite or scratch my hand. The cat was lying inside a depression on the floor of the car. He seemed very agitated. His breathing was accelerated. He looked at me. Our eyes met, and an overwhelming sensation possessed me. Something took hold of my body, a form of apprehension, despair, or perhaps embarrassment for being part of what was taking place. I felt a need to explain to Max that it was my friend's decision, and that I was only helping her. The cat kept on looking at me as if he understood my words. I looked to see if she was coming. I could see her through the glass door. She was talking to the receptionist. My body felt a strange jolt, and automatically I opened the door of my car. "Run, Max, run!" I said to the cat. He jumped out of the car, dashed across the street with his body close to the ground like a true feline. The opposite side of the street was empty. There were no cars parked, and I could see Max running down the street along the gutter. He reached the corner of a big boulevard and then dove through the storm drain into the sewer. My friend came back. I told her that Max had left. She got into the car, and we drove away without saying a single word. In the months that followed, the incident became a symbol to me. I fancied, or perhaps I saw, a weird flicker in Max's eyes when he looked at me before jumping out of the car. And I believe that for an instant that castrated, overweight, and useless pet became a cat. I told Don Juan that I was convinced that when Max had run across the street and plunged into the sewer, his cat spirit was impeccable, and that perhaps at no other time in his life was his catness so evident. The impression that the incident left on me was unforgettable. I told the story to all of my friends. After telling it and retelling it, my identification with the cat became quite pleasurable. I thought myself to be like Max, overindulgent, domesticated in many ways, and yet I couldn't help thinking that there was always the possibility of one moment in which the spirit of man might take over my whole being, just like the spirit of catness took over Max's bloated and useless body. Don Juan had liked the story and had made some casual comments about it. He had said that it wasn't so difficult to let the spirit of man flow and take over. To sustain it, however, was something that only a warrior could do. What about the story of the cat? I asked. You told me you believe that you're taking your chances, like Max, he said. I do believe that. What I've been trying to tell you is that as a warrior, you cannot just believe this and let it go at that. With Max, having to believe means that you accept the fact that his escape might have been a useless outburst. He might have jumped into the sewer and died instantly. He might have drowned or starved to death, or he might have been eaten by rats. A warrior considers all those possibilities and then chooses to believe in accordance with his innermost predilection. As a warrior, you have to believe that Max made it. That he not only escaped, but that he sustained his power. You have to believe. Let's say that without that belief, you have nothing. The distinction became very clear. I thought I really had chosen to believe that Max had survived, knowing that he was handicapped by a lifetime of soft and pampered living. Believing is a cinch, Don Juan went on. Having to believe is something else. In this case, for instance, power gave you a splendid lesson, but you chose to use only part of it. If you have to believe, however, you must use all the event. I see what you mean, I said. My mind was in a state of clarity, and I thought I was grasping his concepts with no effort at all. I'm afraid you still don't understand, he said, almost whispering. He stared at me. I held his look for a moment. What about the other cat? He asked. Huh? The other cat? I repeated involuntarily. I had forgotten about it. My symbol had rotated around Max. The other cat was of no consequence to me. But he is, Don Juan exclaimed when I voiced my thoughts. Having to believe means that you have to also account for the other cat. The one that went playfully licking the hands that were carrying him to his doom. That was the cat that went to his death, trustingly, filled with his cat's judgments. You think you're like Max, therefore you have forgotten about the other cat. You don't even know his name. Having to believe means that you must consider everything. And before deciding that you are like Max, you must consider that you may be like the other cat. Instead of running for your life and taking your chances, you may be going to your doom happily, filled with your judgment. There was an intriguing sadness in his words, or perhaps the sadness was mine. We remained quiet for a long time. Never had it crossed my mind that I might be like the other cat. The thought was very distressing to me. A mild commotion and the muffled sound of voices suddenly forced me out of my mental deliberations. Policemen were dispersing, some people gathered around the man lying on the grass. Someone had propped the man's head on a rolled-up jacket. The man was lying parallel to the street. He was facing east. From where I sat, I could almost tell that his eyes were open. Don Juan sighed. "What a magnificent afternoon," he said, looking at the sky. "I don't like Mexico City," I said. "Why not?" "I hate the smog." He shook his head rhythmically, as if he were agreeing with me. "I would rather be with you in the desert or in the mountains," I said. "If I were you, I would never say that," he said. "I didn't mean anything wrong, Juan. We both know that. It isn't what you mean that matters, though. A warrior, or any man for that matter, cannot possibly wish he were somewhere else. A warrior because he lives by challenge. An ordinary man because he doesn't know where his death is going to find him. Look at that man over there lying on the grass. What do you think is wrong with him? He's either drunk or ill," I said. "He's dying," Don Juan said with ultimate conviction. "When we sat down here, I caught a glimpse of his death as it circled around. That's why I told you not to get up. Rain or shine, you can't get up from this bench until the end. This is the omen we have been waiting for. It is late afternoon. Right now the sun is about to set. It is your hour of power. Look, the view of that man is only for us." He pointed out that from where we sat, we had an unobstructed view of the man. A group of curious bystanders were gathered in a half circle on the other side of him, opposite us. The sight of the man lying on the grass became very disturbing to me. He was lean and dark, still young. His black hair was short and curly. His shirt was unbuttoned and his chest was uncovered. He was wearing an orange cardigan sweater with holes in the elbows and some old beat-up gray slacks. His shoes of some undefined faded color were untied. He was rigid. I couldn't tell whether or not he was breathing. I wondered if he were dying, as Don Juan had said, or was Don Juan simply using the event to make a point? My past experiences with him gave me the certainty that somehow he was making everything fit into some mysterious scheme of his. After a long silence, I turned to him. His eyes were closed. He began to talk without opening them. "That man is about to die now," he said. "You don't believe it, though, do you?" He opened his eyes and stared at me for a second. His look was so penetrating that it stunned me. "No, I don't believe it," I said. I really felt that the whole thing was too easy. We had come to sit in the park, and right there, as if everything were being staged, was a man dying. "The world adjusts itself to itself," Don Juan said after listening to my doubts. "This is not a setup. This is an omen, an act of power. The world upheld by reason makes all this into an event that we can watch for a moment on our way to more important things. All we can say about it is that a man is lying on the grass in the park, perhaps drunk. The world upheld by will makes it into an act of power which we can see. We can see death whirling around the man, setting its hooks deeper and deeper into his luminous fibers. We can see the luminous strings losing their tautness and vanishing one by one. Those are the two possibilities open to us luminous beings. You are somewhere in the middle, still wanting to have everything under the rubric of reason, and yet how can you discard the fact that your personal power rounded up an omen? We came to this park after you had found me where I had been